Welcome to the 4th episode of this series. Last episode, we looked at the motherboard and explored the parts that make up one. Today we'll be taking a deeper dive into a part which is always connected to it. The CPU, or Central Processing Unit. What is a CPU, or Central Processing Unit? A CPU, or Central Processing Unit, is the brain of a computer. Using instructions from programs, it processes data to be sent elsewhere or to be sent to an output device. It also controls what is stored in the RAM and what type of RAM the computer uses. Types of CPUs. There are two main types of CPUs: Complex Instruction Set Computing, or CISC for short, and Reduced Information Set Computing, or ISC for short. Complex Instruction Set Computing, CISC. CISC chips are found in desktops, laptops, and servers. When a processor receives a command, it first has to decode it into a bunch of microcode after determining how many bytes of memory it will use, which the nanoprocessor inside can handle. After each piece has been fully processed, the data is recombined and used. The nanoprocessor is like a processor within the processor. Reduced Instruction Set Computing, RISC. RISC chips are found in mobile devices and other smaller computers. Most of the time, they are soldered to the motherboard, and thus to change the CPU, you also need to change the motherboard. Unlike CISC chips, the commands that RISC chips execute are already microcode, so they don't need to be decoded. The software being executed merely informs the chip which group of commands need to be combined to process the data provided. The resulting circuitry is a lot simpler as a result. Parts of a CPU. No matter what type of CPU, it always has some key components. They are the processing cores, cache, memory controller, a way to connect to the motherboard, and optionally an on-die graphics controller. Processing cores. All CPUs today are multi-core processors. This allows them to operate faster but produce less heat and waste less electricity. The type of core is determined by the type of processor. Cache. All the processing cores need a place to store the data while it's being processed. This is where the cache comes in, and depending on the type of CPU, up to 3 levels of cache are available. The first level is always a part of the processing cores and is unique to each core, but it is small and very fast. The other two layers are bigger and slower and are shared between the cores. Memory controller. The memory controller is what allows the processing cores to speak with the RAM on the motherboard. It controls what type of RAM you can use in the motherboard, as well as arrangement necessary for single, dual, or even triple channel memory. However, the memory controller and RAM is slower than the cache, so is used last to store data. Usually the data stored on RAM is data the processor expects to use later. Of course, sometimes it can also be an actual program that is stored in there that the CPU needs to refer to. On-die graphics processors. Not all processors have an on-die graphics processor, and they are usually found on CISC chips. However, they are generally good enough for basic graphics to let you troubleshoot any issues with a graphics card, but I wouldn't recommend one as the primary graphics for a gaming computer or one that's being designed for more complex graphics. Motherboard connector. Depending on the type of chip, A processor can either be a separate part that needs to be installed into a socket designed for it, or to be soldered to the motherboard. For separate parts, the more delicate parts are inside of a housing that has either pins or holes in the bottom of it. These connect with holes or pins in the connector to allow data and electricity to flow to the chip. If you have one that has pins or the connector has pins, you should be very careful not to bend a single one. Do that, and more than likely the processor or motherboard has become nothing more than a fancy paperweight. They are next to impossible to fix from this. Conclusion. Hope that you've learned a fair bit about the CPU today. You learned about the two main types of processors and about the various parts that make one up. Thank you for your support and the support of those who have chosen to support me on Patreon. Your support is what makes these videos possible. Have a nice day and God bless. See you next time.